Good afternoon, everyone. This is the October 12th, 2021 meeting of the City Finance Committee. May I have a roll call, please?
Yes, Councilmember Harmon.
Here.
And Councilmember Gutierrez. Okay. Committee Chair Friedman.
Here. Thank you. Our President, Councilmember Gutierrez, is trying to get on, having a little technical issues, but hopefully she'll be on shortly. So on to public comment. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to items under the purview of the Finance Committee, but not on today's agenda? Please raise your hand in the app now. And Mr. DiMartini, do you see anyone wishing to speak?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment and I am not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, we'll go ahead and close general public comment and move on to today's item, which is the outside agency requests process for fiscal year 2023 budget. And I will turn it over to Mr. DiMartini for the presentation.
Great, thank you very much, Chair Friedman, members of the committee. My name is Keith DiMartini. I am the city's finance director, and it is my pleasure today to present an overview of the outside agency budget request process for the upcoming budget cycle for fiscal year 2023 and receive direction from the Finance Committee about how to proceed. This item before you this afternoon is in response to feedback that the Finance Committee provided to staff during the prior year budget cycle for fiscal year 22 to really consider potential changes to the process and evaluate how we would like to move forward. So this presentation is in response to your feedback provided to us a number of months ago in preparation for the upcoming budget cycle. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today's presentation is to receive a quick overview of the outside agency funding process and funding that has been provided to nonprofit and other organizations in prior years. Mr. Boudet, the city's budget manager, will provide an overview of the process that was completed in fiscal year 22 in which organizations received some funding. We will then talk about various options for the Finance Committee to consider for potential changes to the existing process, and then hopefully receive your direction at that time and then be able to take any questions and help facilitate any discussion. Next slide, please. So first, let me spend a few moments just giving a brief overview of the city's outside agency funding. Next slide, please. So first, I really wanted to make sure it was out there to all members of the community, really to the Finance Committee, members of the community, nonprofit organizations, that there are currently ways for organizations to receive funding. And this slide here summarizes two of the main ways by which organizations can receive funding. First is through the Santa Barbara County Office of Arts and Culture. They have a very robust grant program for nonprofit organizations that produce and provide arts and cultural programming throughout the community. Another really robust program is the city's community block grant program, or more commonly referred to as the CDBG grant funding. And these are human service programs for social services to low and moderate income residents. And this is run out of the city's community development department. There are also other CDBG programs that are run out of the county and other programs throughout the region. And then there are also many philanthropic community organizations, such as the United Way, among many others, that help facilitate grants to nonprofit organizations. So again, before proceeding with what the city's nonprofit or outside agency funding processes are, we wanted to make sure that there was some shared understanding about what funding is already available. Next slide, please. So the outside agency funding, just a brief overview in fiscal year 22 in the adopted budget, there are more than 20 nonprofit or outside agencies that receive city funding in that budget. The total grant funding for these outside agencies in fiscal year 22 is approximately $4 million. A majority of those grants are funded through the city's general fund. And most agencies have received funding in the past. They are for ongoing annual funding requests for continued services. Next slide, please. So how are those funds used? This slide here is not all inclusive. It's a brief overview of some of the more major grant agreements that the city has in place. They include tourism and downtown marketing and promotion. There are a number of grant agreements with organizations that help run various community events, such as Old Spanish Days, Summer Solstice, and the International Film Festival. There are also grants for media and TV services to the community, homelessness, transition housing, and other human services. There are also grants for the arts, and then many, many others. Again, this is not an all-inclusive list. It's just a brief kind of overview of what typically gets funded in the city's operating budget. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes the annual process at a very, very high level with how the city monitors and enters into grant agreements with nonprofit organizations. It really starts with a proposal from nonprofits about what they intend to do, how they would intend to use the city's money. And then funding is identified through the annual process or for these other organizations that deliver grant funding through an annual cycle that they have. The city will then enter into a grant agreement with that nonprofit that stipulates lots of terms and conditions and scopes of services about what services will be provided to the community. And then they will move into implementation and then monitoring of that grant funded program to make sure that those services are being delivered as promised. And then there will be a reporting requirement from that nonprofit organization that articulates how those funds were spent, what successes were accomplished, any challenges, so on and so forth. There are annual grant agreements that are executed with these nonprofit organizations, and many of them do come to the city council as a separate action during a regular city council meeting for approval. The city has been working over the past number of months to implement a more robust, standardized monitoring and reporting program for these grant agreements. And that includes standardizing invoicing for services rendered on a cycle that is well-defined, and then also standardizing some of the terms and services that are being performed, making sure that the grant agreements and the reports are received in a timely manner, that it really documents and articulates the services that are being offered and provided so that we can trace back and understand what are some of those performance metrics are. So there's continued work in that area to work with our nonprofit partners to be able to ensure that, that those reports are all inclusive. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Bodette, the city's budget manager, who will provide a brief overview of the fiscal year 22 budget process.
Chair, members of the committee. So I'm just going to provide a brief summary of what's been transpiring as far as how we've handled the process currently. Next slide. So as Mr. DiMartini kind of mentioned, the recommended budget in FY2 included the ongoing nonprofit allocation requests that was just previously mentioned. These were reviewed by City Council during our budget departmental hearings through the months of May and April. And while there's been no formal process for additional requests previously, for transparency purposes, we have handled these requests by presenting them to the Finance Committee, getting their recommendations as to whether or not those should be passed on to Council. Number of requests in the past 5 years has ranged anywhere from 1 to 6 approximately. In FY21, because of the economic uncertainty with the COVID-19 pandemic, the Finance Committee actually decided not to entertain any outside requests that's not currently already receiving funding. The type of requests that we typically receive are very consistent with what's already being appropriated and allocated by Council already. They range from homelessness and housing related to economic development to community promotional type events. The dollar amounts have also ranged. We've received anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in requests. So it's been up and down throughout the last 5 years or so. Next slide, please. So what was requested last year we received 5 agency requests. 4 were passed on to council for deliberations, 3 of which were actually recommended by the finance committee, the first 3. And then the economic development partnership, while not recommended by finance committee, was approved by council. So these 4 did receive additional funding, and these all transpired outside of what's already kind of in place within the city's budget. There was a 5th request from Healing Justice that was just received late. It was also deliberated at council, but did not receive funding. And next slide. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Mr. DiMartini to provide some options to consider.
Great, thank you so much. So now let's turn to what options the Finance Committee may want to consider for potential changes to the outside agency budget request process going forward. Next slide, please. So in talking with staff and actually learning quite a bit from the existing grant programs that already exist in the community, from the Office of Arts, as well as the city's CDBG program, staff are presenting and sort of summarizing 3 options for the Finance Committee on this slide, and there may be others, but these are the ones that seem the most inclusive of what our process might be. And so I'll walk through these just at a high level, and next talk about some sort of pose questions and talk about some considerations that the Finance Committee may want to think about when providing direction to staff going forward. So the first 3 options, the 3 options on this slide really start from sort of they cross the spectrum, with on the number 1 being the not really facilitating, not receiving any requests. So requests not being considered whatsoever. And if requests do come into the city from nonprofits for grant funding, referring those requests to funding processes that already exist, such as the Office of Arts or the CDBG program, or potentially others, and really just directing nonprofits or requesters to those existing grant funding options. That would be option number 1. Option number 2 would be the no change option, really continue with the city's existing process. And what that might entail would be, as requests come in, if they're unsolicited, still the city having an obligation to package those together and have a scheduled meeting with the Finance Committee so that the Finance Committee could receive those and consider them, and then make a recommendation to the City Council if you choose to do so, and then the City Council taking an action during the budget process to fund or not fund them. And then option number 3 would be to develop a grant funding policy and a process by which the city would want to facilitate probably like an annual granting process for specific types of grants that the city would want to let out, and then formally communicate an annual cycle, and then also create a formal evaluation process for proposals that may be received. Next slide, please. So this slide here lists a number of factors, questions, or strategies that the Finance Committee may want to consider when thinking about these 3 options or potentially others. First here, are nonprofits aware of existing grant funding opportunities? Is sort of the first question. And I don't know the answer to this question, but we do have a very broad philanthropic community in the area, and there are many ways in which nonprofits can receive funding. And so just really making sure that that communication is strong from the city to nonprofits about how they can secure grant funding from existing mechanisms. Second, what would be the overall strategy or purpose for a city-funded grant program? And then how would these grants in particular supplement existing grant funding that a nonprofit may already be receiving? And so thinking a little bit broadly about what specific targeted functions or areas might the city want to fund through a grant program? Another question might be, what specific services are being desired or needed? Would that include continued services or new requests? So as I mentioned earlier, there are about 20 nonprofits that receive grant funding currently. Would you consider looking at those existing grant agreements as well, or just considering new requests going forward? Really, the question also comes down to funding. Is there adequate funding in the city administrator's recommended budget each year, or what the city council may ultimately need to adopt? In the past few years in particular, there has not been enough money. That's why the proposed budget from the city administrator, when we issue that to the city council in April of every year, it does not include any additional allocation for grant agreements. There just hasn't been enough money as of late. If that may change, right? In the future, that may change. And so as part of what the city administrator recommends in the budget, there could be a potential allocation of money that the city council could potentially use for grant agreements going forward. That might be something to consider or provide direction on as well. Another question or consideration is, how would the city communicate or announce a grant program such as this? And what would the process be? How would those requests be evaluated? How would we staff around those evaluations and ultimately approve and then monitor those grant agreements going forward? Because that will be a body of work depending on how large, how robust a process might be. Next slide, please. So the next steps in the request to the Finance Committee today is for the Finance Committee to discuss and consider various options about how the outside agency budget request process might look going forward, and provide that feedback to staff so that we can use your direction to go ahead and implement whatever that process might look like for fiscal year 23 going forward. And before I open it up to the Finance Committee, I will say I do have two staff members from the Community Development Department, Ms. Stotts and Ms. Doubles, who are very involved in the CDBG process. They are attending today's meeting and would be able to help facilitate questions, as well as Ms. York Rubin from the Santa Barbara County Office of Arts and Culture. She is also with us today if you have any questions for her as well. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chair Friedman. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Mr. DeMartini. Appreciate the presentation and the options presented before us. So before we get into discussion deliberations, we'll do questions from my colleagues. And if we have any questions of Mr. DeMartini or of our staff that are also available, please set those forward. Then we'll go to public comment and then come back for, soon will be a pretty healthy discussion on our options. So Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I just have a question, I think for Mr. DeMartini. If we were to say for this upcoming fiscal year, take the option, option 1, no requests will be considered, but then in some future year, we look at a financial picture that is much rosier and there may be extra money. What I don't want is for us to be in the position 3, 4, 5 years from now, having not developed a process and we're right back to where we are today. Is there any option to consider that says we're not going to take any outside requests next year, but we will add it somewhere on the work plan of your office, recognizing, of course, that you have a huge amount to do to develop a formal process over the next couple of years so that when we do, knock on wood, find ourselves in a more fiscally sound position, we won't be caught flat-footed starting this process of developing a process from scratch. That was a very convoluted question, but hopefully you could follow it. Sorry.
Councilmember Hummer, I believe I did. No, I hear you. And so, yes, I think that we can be sort of flexible and respond to the changes in the economy and changes to the city's financial and budgetary outlook on an annual basis. There might be an opportunity in preparation for each annual budget cycle for the Finance Committee or the City Council to consider, okay, what capacity might we have for potentially new grant agreements or augmentations to existing grant agreements. But again, looking for guidance from council about what specific types of services would be helpful, whether we're targeting specific types of services or nonprofits, for example. That would be a conversation we would have with you in preparation for that.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Any questions from Councilmember Gutierrez?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Friedman. This question is from the Finance Director. For option 3, is it related to the question that Ms. Harmon just mentioned? Would be like analyzing the nonprofits that we have out there, getting the proper information out to the community, and evaluating the nonprofits that come and request money?
Yes, committee member Gutierrez. Yes, that is what we articulated here in option number 3. So it would be similar to the existing sort of grant funding processes that currently exist in the community, where we would have potentially an annual cycle. We put out a call for proposals. We would have very clear and specific guidance as to the types of things that the city might want to fund in this program, have a really structured communication process, probably in multiple languages, and a deadline for nonprofits to adhere to. And then we would have to develop and adhere to an evaluation process to evaluate those proposals, and then have an award process to actually fund those grants. So it would be a rather robust process is what might be envisioned in option number 3.
And for option number 3, we would not fund until that is put in place, right?
Councilmember Gutierrez, that would be my recommendation is yes, until a process was established and this process was fully outlined with a timeline and it was coordinated in some way with the annual budget cycle. My recommendation would be to not move forward with funding until all the parties have come to agreement about how this grant program would look like.
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. So to follow up on setting up a process, aside from we'd have to have some type of funding identified, a funding source, not as funding source, but an amount identified as part of the budget in those deliberations. My question would be, would it be the finance committee that would vet these, or would it be more of a process similar to those we already have established, like CDBG, and we'd have a separate committee? And the reason I asked this, Mr. DiMartini, is if we set up, you can go and turn your camera on and ask a question. So if we were to set up a process for this, would it make more sense to have a separate committee and then it goes to the full council, just like CDBG, or would it be something where it would be a process we establish and then we come to finance?
Yes, Chair Freeman, it's a great question. And it's, quite frankly, it's a little bit challenging to answer that question until sort of the scope of a potential city grant program were to be established about what level of expertise from staff might need to be involved, or if there's any inclination for council to include members of the community in any way in a committee, for example. But I would imagine that at the bare minimum, it would include a level of staff involvement for staff's evaluation and coordination of a program. And then also whether it's through the finance committee or some other citizen run committee or another subcommittee of the city council to take a first pass at receiving staff's recommendations for funding and then making the first pass at that. And then ultimately, I would presume it would be the city council's decision as what gets funded in the budget. But as far as what level of information the city council might receive for specific grant proposals, that is to be determined.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions, so it doesn't seem like there's any others. So I will open up public comment now. Are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please raise your hands in the app. And Mr. DiMartini, do you see anybody with their hand raised?
Chair Freeman, there are a few members attending. No one has their hand raised at this time.
Okay, we'll just give it a couple more seconds here. And not seeing anybody with their hands raised, we'll close public comment, and now we will go back to deliberation. So I'll kind of frame the issue and hear from my colleagues. One is going back in time many years ago, is these outside agency requests came in, and the key word of the presentation is unsolicited. And in order to be more transparent, these were brought forward to the finance committee for transparency, and in order for those agencies to receive a response or at least communication on it. And that itself has led to the challenges we have today without having a formal vetting process. So we do have a 3 and possibly a fourth option that is being presented today. And one is to establish a process if that's something that we think is worthwhile as a finance committee, and then have that put into the finance committee's work plan. And then for when we have better budget circumstances, there might be an opportunity to set that. And so I'd like to hear from my colleagues. What are your thoughts on one? Is this not having a process? Is there continuing with the way it is, or some type of way of developing a process? Probably not for this year. One with our budget challenges, but I think we also need to allocate the staff resources, but I'd like to open it up for comments. So Councilmember Harmon or Gutierrez. Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Sure, I'm happy to start. Yeah, I've always been, for the last 2 years, very uncomfortable with this process. I recognize that so many outstanding organizations and projects and just very worthy causes have been funded through this outside agency process. But to me, it has always felt a bit too much like a black box. It's been really clear that there has not been widespread communication to everyone in the community. You kind of have to know about it to know about it, and perpetuates in my mind just sort of this sense of the city being insular and very insider. So I really have not felt comfortable with it from the beginning, and wanted to start by expressing my appreciation to our finance staff for bringing this item. It's something we've talked about for a couple of years, and I'm really do very much value this conversation and appreciate that it's coming up. Truthfully, I think it is my preference to get rid of the outside requests altogether. I think to the extent that we have extra money, we've already identified processes that are well run, they're vetted through the Office of Arts and Culture, through CDBG. I'm kind of thinking, why reinvent the wheel? In the years that we have extra funding in our budget, can't we just allocate more money to those already existing processes that are well known and well understood in our community? So I think, frankly, that would be my preference. It truthfully seems the most fair, and that's really a priority for me, because I've felt sort of a fundamental sense of unfairness in this process the last couple of years. That said, I would very much be open, depending on where my colleagues are, to developing a process. The one option that I am utterly opposed to is continuing with the existing process as is. So, certainly I think it's a conversation we can have. It just, the questions that Mr. DeMartini put up that need to be answered in developing a process are so big. And it really just seems like such a huge undertaking that, it may behoove us just to utilize those systems we've already put in place that we already know work to support the community. And to the extent that, for example, our CDBG funding is not funding the types of programs that we want to see funded, well, I think it's incumbent on us as council members to take a look at the CDBG priorities. So I think we sort of already have these processes in place, and it may not be necessary to reinvent the wheel. So yeah, I'll close there. I'm interested to see where my colleagues are. I'm leaning toward option one at this point. And then, we can always return at a different time, I think, if it becomes clear that a third way is necessary. So yes, I will stop there and reserve any further comments after I hear the two of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Councilmember Gutierrez.
I'm leaning towards option 3.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. Any further comments or before I go? Okay, so I will. I'll start off by, I've given it a lot of thought and concur with both of you that option 2, the current system that brought us here, is just not an effective, fair or transparent system. But again, it was unsolicited, so it wasn't something that we were requesting. It just came out that way in order to be more transparent and receive these requests. It became one of these issues where you had to know about it to know about it, as Councilmember Harmon said. I am supportive more of option 1 at this point. and a couple of reasons. One is I do have significant budget challenges right now and into the foreseeable couple of years future that we have. And so if we were to set up a process, we would want to ensure that we have the funding to establish it. What I don't want to, what the city or the finance committee to do is to send this this hope that there will be some funding available based on this process, and then every year not every year, but not have funding available. And so then it just gets pushed out every year. I think we do have an opportunity over the next year or two, as the finance committee in particular is going to be looking at our fiscal situation and what we can do to really structurally address our revenues and expenditures and look at that there might be opportunities to really understand that and then revisit this in the future if we wanted to add a process for those types of requests that might fall outside of CDBG or the arts or the established processes we have. But I just don't feel at this time when we have funding. And then I do agree with with Councilmember Harmon, and that if we did have additional funding, our human services and arts grants, they're underfunded as they are. So there might be the opportunity there to reinvest some of that funding that we might have into those programming as well. They've taken some cuts over the last few years as well. So and to create a third process that would potentially compete with them for the limited fundings we have would present its own challenges. So I am supportive for this year, no outside agency requests. And then as we get into future budgets, we would really have to look at if there is even additional funding available. And the last is the staff time and the resources it would take to establish a process. And then once it's a process, what is that staff time and resources, not only in the amount of staff, but the time in terms of cost, budgeting costs that it would take to run such a program, so that we have the proper metrics and the proper outreach that takes place. So a little long-winded there, but I'm at option one. So at this point, we do need to give a motion to staff. So I'll go ahead and, seems like we're here, I'll go ahead and make the motion for efficiency purposes, and option one, which is no outside agency requests considered, and at this time.
I'll second that.
The motion has been made and seconded, and may we get a roll call, please?
Yes, Chair Friedman. So the motion is to discontinue with the outside agency request process for the upcoming budget cycle and not have that process going forward. So roll call. We'll start with committee member Harmon.
Yes.
And committee member Gutierrez.
Yes.
And committee chair Friedman.
Yes.
Okay, that motion passes unanimously.
Thank you, Mr. DeMartini. And then before we adjourn the meeting, one point of clarification. This is inside the finance. It does not go to council for review. Is that correct, Mr. DeMartini?
Yes, Chair Freeman. This action taken by the Finance Committee does not need to go to the City Council. This is direction to staff in preparation for the upcoming budget cycle. So there is no specific action I believe that the City Council is required to take.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to clarify that point. And with that, there's no other further business. So this meeting of the Finance Committee is adjourned. Thank you.